It took a while, but we finally have solid footage of the multiplayer for Armored Core 6. Bandai hosted an hour-long session of mostly 3v3 gameplay, with a very brief 1v1 afterward. I know there's been some clamoring for PvP analysis from me, since I mostly deal with Armored Core multiplayer, so I'll be giving some thoughts and impressions from the event, and sprinkling in my analysis using my long history of PvP experience on top of that. The immediate thing that stood out to me when seeing the fights themselves was the respawn mechanic. My initial gut reaction to this was negative, with it being a far cry from anything we've seen in AC. It looked more in line with the traditional team deathmatch, or more like the Elden Ring arena. My negative impression didn't last too long though, because with my past experience I knew just how awful the balance of AC PvP has been when there's more than 2 players involved. The strongest strategy has always been to gang up on one person, to lower the player count on the other team, then play out the remainder of the match with a personnel advantage. Traditionally, 1v1s would last anywhere up to 5 minutes, but 2v2s would hardly ever go beyond 1 to 2 minutes. I'll throw in a quick disclaimer that I have not played the 5th generation enough to talk about it, so its team combat might be way better balanced. AC's 6's respawn mechanic seems to smooth out the ganking problem, and assures that outside the short respawn time, there's always an even amount of players on both teams. With this style of team deathmatch, the hard lock-on, and the seemingly very fast time to kill, given what we've seen, the multiplayer seems very arcade-like. By that I mean its non-stop action of kill or be killed. It kinda takes me back to the days of playing the old Gundam vs games like Federation vs Xeon. The overall speed of the AC seems to be on the slower side, which I find quite agreeable. What's slightly unsettling though, is the general lack of fine control the ACs look to have. Quite often I saw the ACs looking like slow floating balloons in the air, without the ability to dodge incoming fire. This feeling was exaggerated by the overall short engagement distances. The lack of dodging and auto-locking made for short kill times. This might be a consequence of the team matches, or it just might be the real low skill set of the players we're watching. Who knows how multiplayer will look when everybody gets their hands on the game and gets familiar with it. Before making this video I put my hazmat suit on, and ventured deep down into the depths of Reddit, to read the opinions of its dwellers, and I was seeing quite a lot of complaints about tanks being OP and the game being very damage racy. I can see the fights leading to this way of thinking, but again, we're dealing with a very inexperienced group of players, and on top of that, they're playing with ACs that have a very limited pool of parts to choose from. Complaining about tanks or damage racing being overpowered, using this event as evidence, is akin to complaining about people spamming fireballs or mashing uppercuts in Wake Up in Street Fighter on day 1. Yeah, strats like this might work really well in low-level gameplay, but it doesn't fly at all in high-level gameplay, and will get you punished. Overboard getting his ass handed to him by FightinCowboy seems less of a case of tanks and hardlock being overpowered, and more of a case of him failing to understand how the matchup potentially works, and being insistent on trying to outgun a tank who has 2 Gatling guns at close to medium range. As a PvP example from a game where tanks are strong, we'll talk about Armored Core 9breaker. The most optimal way to kill a tank in its multiplayer was to stay at range where you could more readily react to cannon rounds, and outpoke the tank over the course of 5 minutes with high precision weapons, while at the same time dodging more than the tank could at range using your mobility advantage. All of this can be done comfortably while the tank has to lock on you as well, so the presence of auto-lock wouldn't change the dynamic of this type of combat. High-level PvP in old AC games consisted of a heavy neutral game, with lots of long-range poking and keep away while having an AP lead. It focused more on dodging projectiles than evading the opponent's lockbox altogether in very close range. As can be seen at the start of the fight from Cowboy's perspective, when Ouroboros did have decent range on him, Cowboy's FCS was lagging behind trying to keep a lock. This might be because he had an FCS more specialized for his close range Gatling guns. However, Ouroboros eventually failed to keep his range. It looks like he attempted to backpedal at the start of the match, but Cowboy quickly caught up to him, and from there on out his range control was suboptimal. He ran out of energy and his boosting wasn't gaining him much distance. I think the result of this match was less of a case of tanks and autolock being overpowered, and either more of a case of Ouroboros building an AC that's suboptimal for its use, or Cowboy just being a way stronger PvP player than Ouroboros. What his AC might be missing is a stronger booster or generator, which would allow for much better range control. AC games traditionally don't give players their strongest boosters in the early game, and it just so happened the players of the showcase were limited to early game parts. Cowboy did mention later on that he also thought Ouroboros didn't play the matchup correctly, and should have stayed at range and attempted to outpoke him using his linear rifles, or that if he had missiles he would have fared way better. Now, there is an element in AC PvP requiring you to build an AC capable of handling as much varied situations as possible, otherwise it just won't do too well, But I'll also point out that AC PvP has always been somewhat matchup dependent, with some being more one-sided than others. This is especially true in a game whose weapons and mechanics are more effective in general. A game like Ninebreaker, for example, plays out to be more rock paper scissors like in its matchups, with clear winners and losers than a game like Last Raven, where weapons are overall less effective but the matchups aren't as extreme. The reason for this is because when the game does more of the work for you, it leaves less room for the effort of the player to overcome the matchups. Only time will tell how AC6 plays out in this regard. On that note, let's go ahead and address the biggest element of contention, and most talked about mechanics surrounding AC6, since its very first gameplay was shown. Yeah, we're talking hard lock-on, specifically how it changes the dynamic of AC PvP. I'm still of the belief that even with the hour-long event, we still haven't seen enough of the multiplayer to truly know how hard lock-on will eventually affect the meta. Seeing an hour of PvP is well and good, but it doesn't compare at all to being able to play the game and feel the game for yourself over the course of several weeks. And doing so versus other countless players that have a full arsenal of parts the game has to offer. One thing is for certain though, that there is an undeniable loss in accuracy when using hard lock-on. It's been confirmed by the devs and the select few who have played the game already. On a more surface level analysis of the PvP event, yeah, I would say the hard lock-on looked very overbearing, and highly dictated the flow of the gameplay shown. But again, I'm going to reinforce the idea that we're not even seeing day one gameplay from only a couple people who have limited playtime on their hands. There were moments of the fighting that showed just how inaccurate the guns can be with hard lock-on. Given that AC PvP usually evolves into long-range poking, it would make sense to me that over time, more and more people will use a more soft lock style aiming to run this type of playstyle more effectively. In other words, they'll have to put in more effort to play a more optimal playstyle of fighting. Close range combat has usually been a weaker PvP strategy throughout this series. For example, trying to use melee weapons. And most of this comes down to just how hard it is to keep a lock on an opponent in close range, due to the random nature people move. The hard lock-on looks like it would benefit the close range style to keep a lock on the opponent. But if I had to take a wild guess, I'm going to say that over time, things would balance out with the hard lock-on helping a more close quarters aggressive playstyle, while more effort has to be put in for the more traditional and more optimal poking playstyle. I'm an old school Raven at heart, and I was perhaps thrown off as much as anybody else with the lack of traditional FCS lockbox and fully manual aim. However, I'd like to point out that a hard lock-on will give AC6 a much smaller barrier to entry. I consider a game's multiplayer only as hard and competitive as its community is, and when everybody has hard lock-on as a tool at their disposal, its competitive advantage tends to disappear in the grand scheme of things. I've always been of the opinion that the best competitive games are low skill floor with a high skill ceiling. In other words, easy to get into, but difficult to master. Over the past several months, I've read so many comments from people and their frustrations with the past AC games and their controls. Most were aimed at the really old AC games that had what we dub now as Type B controls, that utilized the controller as shoulder buttons instead of the analog sticks to control your AC and camera movement. But even the PvP of later games can get a little perplexing when trying to aim the camera at their breakneck speeds. I think given what we've heard so far with how lock-on has clear limitations, it means that AC6 might fall into that easy to get into but difficult to master category. A game that's easier to get into means a larger player base. A larger player base that sticks with the game over time means more competition and ultimately a higher skill ceiling. But again, only time will tell. Anyways guys, this wraps up my impressions for AC6's multiplayer. I hope to see you guys out there on the battlefield. Fly high, Ravens.